Welcome to tonight's edition of Resistance TV, where we're going to be speaking about the government's chaotic response to the COVID-19 crisis. We know from looking at the statistics that the death rates in Britain are amongst the worst anywhere in the world. We've seen the government using the COVID crisis as an opportunity, frankly, for the private sector to make a killing. We've seen the test and trace system being outsourced and being utterly chaotic and really not fit for purpose. We've seen other private healthcare companies also cashing in on the terrible situation, and the support for workers, for the economy, has been very hit and miss. And now the Chancellor's announced a new scheme, the post-furlough scheme, that we particularly want to focus on initially anyway in the discussion this evening, in terms of getting the panel's view on what they think of that and what alternative solutions the government ought to be putting forward, and what we as citizens in the country ought to be demanding of our representatives in Parliament. We've got a great panel this evening. Unfortunately, one of our guests, though, has been unable to join us. She's not very well, Kerry-Ann Mendoza, who, as I'm sure everybody will be aware, is the editor-at-large for The Canary. But we still have three other excellent speakers this evening, although there's some technical difficulties with Steve Headley, who is the Assistant General Secretary of the RMT. So I'm hoping we can sort those technical difficulties out before we come to him to get his thoughts on the situation in relation to COVID. But our other two guests are Ian Hodson, who is the National President of the Bakers Union, and Jyoti Brar, who is the deputy leader of the Workers' Party. And people may have seen the Workers' Party have put forward an idea to address the COVID crisis and to raise additional finance. They're calling for a COVID tax on wealthy elites in the country. And so I think for our opener this evening, we'll go straight to Jyoti and get her thoughts on the COVID crisis and the idea that the Workers' Party have been putting forward as a potential solution to it. So over to you, Jyoti, your opening this evening's discussion.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Chris, for that introduction. Thanks so much for having me with you this evening. It's much appreciated. The COVID crisis is not the cause of inequality in Britain, and coronavirus as a health crisis is not the cause of the economic crisis. That's very much our view, but it has really highlighted and deepened the existing inequalities in our society, and to a point where it's becoming clear to everybody that they are absolutely unsustainable. And so the Workers' Party has launched a campaign for a one-off tax. We're calling it the Corona tax because people understand, this is the coronavirus crisis that we're in at the moment. We want a 5% tax on fortunes of more than £10 million. Now, that affects a very tiny proportion of, as you said, wealthy elites in this country, people who have amassed the great wealth that has been produced by workers here and abroad into their private hands. We don't have exact numbers, how many people that would affect. We think perhaps around 20,000 people. Some 4,500 people have fortunes of over 80 million. And the tax on those people alone, 80 million each, these people, the tax on those people alone would raise 17 billion. So you can see a tax on all 20,000 who have each a fortune of more than 10 million, 5% of that. As George Galloway said, if I had 10 million, I'd be ashamed not to pay over, $500,000 to help out the people who right now are facing destitution. And this is really the issue. We have this situation in the world where there's 8 billionaires controlling more wealth than half the planet's population, which is like 3.5 billion people. This inequality is glaring, it's unsustainable, it's absolutely unjust. And given the crisis that we're facing, people need help immediately. Right now, people need a pay rise, people need rent freezes, we need to stop evictions, we need to invest in infrastructure, keep our key industrial jobs going, we need to give people work and pay properly. The fact that in a country as wealthy as Britain, we have 5 million people expected to fall into utter destitution this year is insane, it's shocking, it's shameful, and it needs to be addressed right now. And just as a little aside, we have addressed this petition to the Labour Party rather than to the government. Really, we want to highlight the fact that the Labour Party is in fact a part of the problem and not a part of the solution, that it really stands in the way of workers organising themselves in their own interests, Chris.
Yeah, no, indeed. I mean, and I think one of the things I would, of course, say, though, in relation to the tax idea, and it's something which I very much support, but not so much necessarily to raise the finance that we need to address the crisis, because as a currency issuing nation, I mean, money is no issue in reality, but clearly there is a massive problem that you've alluded to in relation to inequality in Britain, and obviously we do need to deal with that to ensure that people who have these massive fortunes do acquire huge influence and distort the way policy is made in the country, and that's a real cause of concern, and why we have such a skewed system, I think, which has actually led to 40 living in poverty, while at the same time we've got these huge wealthy elites who are not paying their way. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that, Britain being a currency issuing nation, and we should be immediately, in my opinion, demanding that the government invest and ensuring that nobody's left behind as a result of this COVID crisis. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that, Jyoti, particularly?
I do, yes. So there's kind of two ways of looking at that situation. One is, given that the ruling class, the banks, are prepared to print billions of pounds in order to bail out big business, why could they not do the same for the working class? That's one way of looking at it, and I think that's your main point, and I absolutely concur with that. There's another way of looking at it, which I would slightly disagree with your analysis, that because we have our own currency, we are able to print money with no consequence. Money has a real meaning. It does reflect something. It's not just a piece of paper. You don't just need a printing press for your money to be worth something. The money which circulates in the economy is roughly equal to the value of the goods which are circulating in the economy. If you print more money, therefore, ultimately you are devaluing the currency. And one of the things, the tricks with quantitative easing that's been played on the people is it's actually theft. It is a pay cut for everyone whose wages don't go up. It is a pension cut. It is a savings cut. Anyone with a fixed income, their income is worth less. It has less purchasing power because the price of goods goes up as a result of printing money. So it's not a cost-free exercise. But given that the ruling class is happy to do it in order to put liquidity into the financial system, the stock market is where most of that money has ended up, creating fortunes for the already super rich. Yeah, absolutely. Why can't they do it for us?
No, I agree. I mean, and I'm not just sort of saying, you create money without consequence. Clearly, what you need to ensure is that you are matching that to the spare capacity that's available in the economy. And there is a lot of spare capacity in the economy at the minute. Far too many people are unemployed. Many people are underemployed. There's massive need for public services. Social care is in crisis. Public services across the piece are not working properly. We've seen with this COVID crisis the utter catastrophe that's befallen so many people in Britain. I was already mentioning millions of people in poverty, the fifth biggest economy in the world. I mean, it's an absolute scandal. So, yeah, I mean, I think what we need to ensure that we do is that, as a currency issuing nation, is that we use that flexibility to ensure that we invest where appropriate, and we meet the spare capacity by making the resources available for it. It's interesting. The only kind of deficit that the government ever seems to be concerned about is the fiscal deficit, and the truth is they're not bothered about the deficit in poverty, the deficit in public services, the quality of public services, deficit in healthcare, and it's for those reasons I think we need to be coming together to be demanding better from our representatives and ensure that they represent the people that put them there rather than the wealthy elites who seem to have so much influence. But let me move, if I may, now though to Ian Hodson from the Bakers Union, and just get his perspective on the situation. I was reading in the Morning Star, I think it was yesterday actually, that the TUC saying that the latest proposition from the government is just a drop in the ocean and won't save us, says the TUC. I mean, what's the Bakers Union perspective on the way in which the government's been handling the COVID crisis, and how have your members been coping with the situation with the furlough and all the rest of it?
Well, I mean, I think the TUC is absolutely right. The situation that we find ourselves and what the government's putting on the table now is just a drop in the ocean, and it won't save jobs. In fact, it will probably force employers to make that decision to lose employment, because obviously we've struggled to get employers to top up the 80% payment. So the idea that they're going to provide a third of hours to people and then supply a top up in with the government to a maximum of 77% of their earnings is delusionary. The government is you know, its ideas behind that are not going to work. We haven't seen employers stepping up in this crisis. We've seen employers, you know, be happy to take the 80% and keep people employed, yes, and it has, you know, stopped huge redundancies from happening up to press. But we do know that these companies are planning for the end of the furlough scheme to make huge announcements, which is going to have a significant impact on jobs in this country. I mean, you know, obviously we represent Greggs workers, for instance. I mean, Greggs are one of those companies that did try and do the right things by their employees. They did furlough and did top up their wages. But of course, the announcement that happened in August for the Eat Out to Help Out scheme meant we poured, you know, millions and millions of pounds of taxpayers' cash into the banks of multi-global corporations like McDonald's, and not into companies like Greggs. So we're now in discussions about job losses that are going to impact across Greggs, which, you know, hasn't relied on 0 hours, didn't pay minimum wage, and didn't use youth rates. You know, it actually paid its workers properly and gave them real benefits. But they're going to be hit more so because obviously they didn't benefit from any of the taxpayers' cash that was handed out by the government in August. And I think, you know, what we've seen from the government, I mean, it's you know, most of our members, you know, did work during the pandemic. They, you know, the major crisis and the lockdown, they were in work and keeping Britain fed. We put in place measures to protect workers. And then the government came along, and of course, and changed its 2 metre rule into 1 metre plus, whatever that actually meant. And the reality of that is you know, 1 metre plus can be anything. You know, it doesn't actually mean anything at all. And you know, that was just so they could try and open up the economy, in our opinion, too soon without putting the proper measures in place. As we've seen as well in schools and colleges and universities, you know, there was measures they needed to put in place, and they failed to do so, which obviously has led to this, you know, massive increase all of a sudden in cases. But we shouldn't be surprised. I think that the government's handling of this crisis has been absolutely appalling, you know, and our members, you know, are going to struggle as we go through, because of decisions made in Parliament, and unfortunately as well, I've got to say, you know, and we've expressed our concerns. The Labour Party's position in supporting the government instead of opposing some of the things is not putting us in a better place at all. You know, we are really concerned about the future of a lot of our members. You know, I mean, by the way, McDonald's. I mean, I was listening to a Zoom call earlier on where McDonald's are still paying out over £1 billion to shareholders during this crisis, yet benefiting from tax through the furlough scheme and obviously from the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. It's appalling.
On a wider point, Ian, I mean, do you not think that the COVID crisis has brought into sharper focus, really, the failings of a kind of corporate capitalist system that has been holding sway really forever in this country, and has got worse, of course, with the kind of neoliberal agenda since 1979, which has really put workers in a very kind of vulnerable position. We know that millions and millions of people in Britain are now on in precarious employment, 0-hour contracts, etc. Many of the sort of companies where you try and organise workers will try and sort of exploit their workers. Why it's so important for people to join a trade union. But do you think there's an opportunity for us to press the reset button? I mean, on the way the economy is organised, and what are the unions doing, if anything, to demand that? Do you think?
Well, I'd say a couple of things on that. I mean, yes, there is an opportunity to press the reset button. I would definitely agree with that. I mean, one of the things I would say on that is obviously we've launched a campaign with DL Organised in relation to statutory sick pay. You know, I mean, statutory sick pay has always been very low, but I think during this pandemic, it's become quite clear that it's not fit for purpose. I mean, you know, people are being faced with a challenge of do I go into work with the symptoms and and risk the spreading of the virus, or do I stay at home and have to try and survive on £95 and 85 pence a week, which is equivalent to £13.70 a day. I mean, you know, what we're calling for on that particular issue is that we believe that, you know, there should be a levelling up, and companies who don't provide sick pay should be levied, and they should be, you know, guaranteeing, you know, the government should be guaranteeing workers at least 6 weeks full pay. And if you're a 0 hours contract worker, then it should be at least the average of the last 12 weeks that you've worked. And we think that would be fair, and make sure that people can do the right things, one by their own family, and make those decisions to be able to afford to isolate without the risk of losing their home or being unable to put food on the table or pay for the heating, especially in the winter. You know, and I think, you know, that needs to be addressed, and that is one of the areas for certain, you know, that we need to consider. I mean, alongside the job insecurity we saw at the beginning of this crisis, people like Tim Martin, for example, making a decision that, all right, the government was announcing the furlough scheme, but he wasn't going to pay his workers until the government put that money in his bank, because he wasn't going to take the risk of that money not going into his bank. Well, workers shouldn't have to rely on a system that may or may not. I mean, obviously we shamed him, and, you know, we were successful in getting him to pay his workers, which was good, and they didn't have to go and work at Tesco's. But again, you know, I stress that 80% of low-paid workers' earnings is even lower paid than what they're normally used to. And I'll give you another example. I mean, I was up in Berwick-on-Tweed talking to some furloughed workers there who were, you know, having a take-home pay of £180 a week, and £120 of that was going on to their rent. So they were left with £60 to feed themselves, pay the council tax, pay for the food, you know, any transport that they needed. I mean, you can't survive. I mean, our income base is far too low in work. We need to do something about addressing the issue of low pay. We need to do something about addressing the issue of insecurity, because another concern we have is that this is going to be an opportunity for employers to obviously to sack and rehire. And we're starting to see, you know, those companies that do rehire not issue contracts of employment, but offer 0 hour contracts.
And it's not just, of course, the insecurity in relation to employment. It's the insecurity in relation to housing. We have a huge housing crisis in this country. It's been below the surface. I think it's perhaps not been on, you know, everybody's radar unless you're actually affected by it. But we know that as a consequence of the COVID crisis, the impact on people's employment patterns and so on, and the fact that so many people now are forced to rent in the private renter sector, where there is very little protection compared to how it used to be. I mean, there used to be regulated private sector tenancies. There were many more council houses back when I was growing up in the halcyon days, 1970s, etc. Well, council houses have all been flogged off, and they've been residualised. Private rented accommodation has ballooned, and as has the housing benefit costs associated with that. And the government's response to it, and I regret to say the Labour Party in large measure went along with this, was to penalise the victims of government policy failures, successive government policy failures to regulate the private sector rents. And the response was, as I'm sure you're aware, Ian, to introduce a benefit cap, which penalised the victims of this policy failure. It wasn't their fault. I mean, as I say, again, when I was a lad growing up in the 70s, working class people were able to aspire to buy their own house, even in places like London, where it's absolutely prohibitively expensive now to rent, never mind buy somewhere. I mean, many of my mates, I was involved in the animal rights movement back then, were able to buy, and I knew people in London, they were able to buy. I mean, it was working class guys and girls who were able to buy. A bit more expensive than where I was in Derby. But isn't that an issue for your members as well in terms of housing? And again, don't we need to be demanding a massive renaissance in council housing, particularly given that this Tory government has lifted the cap on the housing revenue account? So there's no real barrier now to local authorities building in the way in which they used to be. But none of them seem to be doing very much about it. I mean, I just wonder whether other trade unions raising that as an issue, and how can we kind of push this forward?
I mean, I hear what you say on the housing. I mean, sometimes when I've been interviewed, and I get asked a question, which is the most burning issue you've trade union, and obviously people always expect me to turn to the issue of pay or insecurity of employment. But actually, I think housing is the biggest issue that we face, and I do think the ability to provide decent homes in this country is the biggest issue that we face on from that perspective, because I always think that if people are in a secure accommodation or in secure homes, they've got a decent place to live. Obviously, it reduces the risk of mental health as well. So their health is improved by having a secure home. And then I always think that after that, we can then sort out the issues of low pay and insecure work. But I mean, I do believe, the biggest issue that people face, first and foremost, is the right to have a decent place to live. And yes, it does impact on our members. And like I say, if someone's paying £120 a week rent and only earning 180 quid, it's not sufficient to live on. I mean, but yes, the housing issue in this country is abysmal, and for far too long, we've allowed the media to portray this crisis in homes as being the fault of people coming into this country, and it's absolutely nothing to do with anybody other than politicians who have made decisions to sell off our council houses and not to replace them with new council housing stock, to expect that people on low pay or on 0 hours contracts to be able to go out and get a mortgage. I mean, again, I've used the word delusional already, but it is completely delusional. People on a 0 hours contract cannot go out and get a mortgage, and yet they may be working full time.
No, indeed. Let me see if I can bring in Steve. I know we're having some technical difficulties with Steve's connection. Steve Headley, have we got Steve now, or is he?
Yes, I'm here, Chris. I don't know if you can hear me. Yeah,
we can hear you, Steve. So we can't see you, but right. It's your words that we're most interested in. Although we'd love to see we'd love to see your very handsome features as well. But if we can't have that, you can't have everything sometimes in life. We'd like to hear from you. I mean, just I'd like to get your take and the RMT's take on the government's response, obviously, to the COVID crisis. And the point that Ian was just making, I don't know if you heard it, Ian, talk about this kind of divide and rule strategy of blaming migrants for the housing crisis and, the shortages in relation to the healthcare provision and so on. And I know that you have done a lot in actually, fighting those kind of bigoted views. But perhaps you could just maybe start, Steve, by giving us the RMT's thoughts in relation to the COVID situation and how you've been responding as a trade union on behalf of your members.
Well, first of all, let's put it into a better context. The amount that's been paid on the total scheme for furloughing people is less than 20% that they used to bail out the banks during the financial crisis. So let's remember that they spent trillions of pounds. They bail out their friends in the banks. Now, we have to say that the COVID scheme's better than nothing in our industry. but it's coming to an end, and we're facing thousands of redundancies, possibly tens of thousands of redundancies very soon. And this is from companies who have taken billions of taxpayers' money, continue to be financed with taxpayers' money, are still paying millions out to their shareholders through the money that you pay through your taxes. And they're laying people off, attacking terms and conditions and attacking jobs. And that's in the railway, the bus industries, the offshore and the shipping industries, where only recently people have got minimum wage. If people didn't know that, we still have people working for £3 an hour, £3.50 an hour because they're foreign nationals in British ports on British routes. So that's absolutely shameful. But we've said the government, if these companies on the railways, and I don't know about other people, I can't speak for other trade unions, if these companies on the railways are intent on taking the taxpayers' money to pay out to their shareholders, well, the simple solution is this. What we have to do is bring all these industries under national control and eventually under workers' control. We nationalise them all. Because what is the point of having a middleman? It's a sort of money laundering or operation. The government gives taxpayers' money to these companies, these private companies, the railway companies, and they transfer that money to their shareholders. They're not investing it in the railway or safety or passengers or indeed staff. They're just using that money to run off and do what they want. So our position as a union is all these industries, bus, rail, maritime, offshore, should all be nationalised, and that money brought back into the economy and swell the coffers of this country, so we can actually use that money, and it's been mentioned already, on necessary projects like infrastructure and like housing, where it's an absolutely appalling situation. On the point of this crisis, well, crises are things that happen periodically within a capitalist system. And we have a clear policy as a union. We want to supersede capitalism with a socialist form of society. And I think we've got to look at it, because we now know who the essential workers are. And we know that it's not essential that these people on mega salaries go to work every day. They don't have to. And indeed, a lot of working class people don't have to go to work. They can stay at home and they can work from home. And look at that benefits that that could have on the environment. And we have to reassess all these things. It's an opportunity to reassess these things. And what is the point in somebody travelling into the city and an hour there, an hour back, paying, the argument is that they have to keep the economy going, so they pay 10 quid for a crap sandwich with crap nutritional value, and then they come home again. Well, why can't that person work from home and have a better quality of life if that's possible? And I'm sure we can reorientate the economy to that. But as far as the transport system goes, we might have to rationalise that as well, but we have to not scare people. We have to say that these people will be used to do something socially productive. We don't want to put workers on the dole. We want to get them to do something that benefits society and pay them the money that deserves. So we know who the key workers are. We have to make sure that everybody else who's doing unnecessary work, which this capitalist system forces upon them, is redeployed to do something socially useful. And that's the kind of economy, I believe, that the RMT Constitution wants.
Yeah. How has the COVID crisis been affecting your members, and what's been the union's response? How have the companies, the rail companies and the other companies where you organise workers, how do you feel they've been responding, Steve, to the crisis in terms of protecting workers' health and safety, and also in terms of the the financial situation for workers that you represent?
Well, the people that have been directly employed, by and large, have been, well, quite reasonably treated. It's the people who have been on contractors, subcontractors, who have been, by and large, been laid off, precarious employment, 0 hours contracts, all that, what you would expect. And the model of employment has to change in order to alter that. Now, we are seeing, and we've seen it already, Chris, you mentioned before, I forgot to pick it up when you asked the question. We have this government and we have these racists out there now trying to blame what is a crisis of a system and a crisis even within capitalism of an absolute mishandling of this COVID crisis by this government. And then attack on foreigners, or and then attack on kids who want to go out and socialise, or people that go to pubs, anybody but the people that actually make the decisions, which are the government. And we as trade unions have to fight that. The bosses, of course, are quite happy to use immigrant labour to try and divide and rule. And what I mean by that, obviously, we as a trade union want to organise everybody. But what they'll do is they'll lay the staff off first who are casually employed, which usually happen to be black or Asian or East European, because they've been there less time. They haven't been part of the nationalised industry before, and they've got they're easier to sack. So that's causing problems in itself. And we as a union, of course, our stance is that everybody is a worker, no matter where they're from, no matter what race they're from, no matter what religion they're from. And that's our basis. Our basis is class solidarity. But we're going to have to watch this, because inevitably, when potentially millions of people go under the dole, the far right are going to be attacking us, and they're going to be attacking immigrants, Muslims, whoever, by saying that these people are here taking your jobs and your houses. When of course the solution is they create more jobs and build more houses.
Absolutely, and that's certainly what we should be demanding. And clearly, there is a gap, isn't there, in terms of the political representation, in terms of coming forward with the sorts of solutions that you've been alluding to, and indeed Jyoti and Ian for that matter. I mean, what can the trade union movement do to ensure that the sort of policies that some of the policies you've been talking about there, Steve, are, as we know from opinion polls, very popular with the wider general public? How can we get our elected representatives in Parliament to implement those policies? What can the trade union movement do? What can the wider Labour movement do? And what can the workforce really? I mean, the people across the country. What can we be doing, or what should we be doing? Do you think, to try and bring about some of these, what seem to me to be kind of common sense proposals? I used to talk about common sense socialism, and what you talk about, it just seems to me as eminent common sense. What can we do, given what happened at the last general election, to try and bring about these changes? Because it seems to me the governments and the country seems to be going in the opposite direction from the sort of common sense perspectives that you've just set out.
Well, Chris, I've come to the conclusion I've torn up my Labour Party membership card today. I think the party's over in no uncertain terms, and the reason that I took that decision was the way that the Labour MPs failed to vote against the Government Criminal Act, which allows state murder, sexual violence, torture, and we'd only 20 Labour MPs had the guts to vote against that. I see Keir Starmer as an absolute sociopath. I think he's a person who would do anything for power. He will abandon all the principles. He's already made it clear that he wants a return to Blairism. He's been quite blatant about that. So what the trade unions are better off doing, I think, is forming a political party. We're right back to where we were 100 years ago. The trade unions are not being represented by any political party right now. The Corbyn experiment has failed. In fact, the leaders of the Corbyn experiment abandoned the experiment, abandoned all their principles halfway through the fight. So we need to start again. We have to recognise that the Labour Party is going nowhere, and the trade union movements, by financing such a party that are going to actually attack us, are doing our members no favours, and are doing our members actually a lot of damage. So that's what I think we should be doing. We should be having discussions about how we can get a party that's going to represent the working class. And I don't mean a sect. I don't mean where you all have to agree with a great leader, or you have to agree with Trotsky or Stalin or all those figures from the early the centuries ago. What we have to do is address people's problems today: the lack of housing, the lack of democracy in this country, the increasing authoritarianism, the international wars carried out in our name, which are not backed by anybody, really, any proportion of people in this country. We have to bring these home to people. And the trade union movement really have to stop flogging a dead horse. Labour Party's over. They've got to put their money where their mouth is and get a party that will represent working class people.
In the meantime, Jyoti, I mean, obviously you're representing of the Workers' Party. I mean, obviously there's a lot of things that we've been talking about this evening in terms of what's wrong, and we've come forward with some common sense ideas in terms of trying to make those or suggest those changes. But what can we do to try and, in the absence of political representatives who are prepared to take forward some of these ideas? I mean, certainly this government is never going to take forward, I don't think, not willingly anyway, the ideas that have been discussed this evening, even though they are incredible common sense. What can we do to bring about the change that the country desperately needs, Jyoti, in your opinion, in the short term as well as the medium and longer term?
I think what we need is, Steve's absolutely right, and Steve, Ian, Chris, there's a home for all of you in the Workers' Party if you want to join with us in our efforts. We need to build a working class party that is prepared to represent the interests of the workers, not follow in the wake of the capitalist class, as the Labour Party has shown itself time and time again to do. That's absolutely necessary. Yes, we need militant, strong trade unions like the RMT, which are able to take action on behalf of their members because they are not tied to the Labour Party, which itself is tied to capitalism. A party and trade unions. And of course, we need independent media. Workers are rightfully suspicious of mainstream media these days. Many people are cynical and recognize they're being lied to. They don't trust politicians. They don't trust journalists like they don't trust estate agents. But they don't know what the truth is. They don't know where to turn for an analysis they can trust. And a new media is also something we desperately need to build. It's my view that the greatest strides in this direction have been made by George Galloway. That's why he's the leader of our party. That's why we're very proud to be able to have such a weapon, at our head. But we are not just a one-man party. We are a party for all workers who agree with the things that Steve was talking about earlier, that we need a workers' control of the economy, a planned economy that serves the interests of the people and puts human logic at the heart of everything it does, rather than the capitalist logic of profit before all.
But in the short term, though, Jyoti, I mean, obviously we're faced with this COVID crisis at the moment, and workers potentially, losing their jobs, having substantial reductions in their incomes, potentially losing their homes, unable to pay their rent or their mortgage, lack of support, frankly, from the government, or inadequate support anyway from the government. I mean, indeed, even at the height of the furlough scheme, many people fell through the gaps. Any thoughts on what could be done in the short term to try and force a change? I mean, I think there have been some direct action, for example, to prevent evictions in the past, and whether or not that's something that could be organised. Is that something that you think could be done, or what other ideas might you?
Absolutely, yeah. we need to rebuild an unemployed workers movement, tenants movements, as well as militant trade unions. Fundamentally, we have to get organised. There is going to be nothing that forces the ruling class apart from pressure from the working class. And as workers, our strength is only in numbers. So as difficult as it is to build meaningful organisation, there isn't actually another answer that works. There's no shortcut to that. We have to organise. Yeah.
Well, I mean, talking of organising, I mean, Ian, the Bakers Union, organising in an area which is not easy to organise, it's got to be said, have had some fantastic successes. And I think both the Bakers Union and the RMT are wonderful adverts, frankly, for the benefits of being a trade unionist, because, the terms and conditions that workers who are organised by a trade union are substantially better than those who are not, although the trade union membership is not what it was back, as I was mentioning, of the halcyon days of the 1970s, when I think it was 12 or 13 million people were a member of a trade union. The Transport and General Workers Union alone had over 2 million members. Closed shops were around, and collective bargaining ensured that workers did enjoy a bigger proportion of the national cake, of the national income, as it were, and every year a bigger and bigger proportion went to workers in their wage packets. But it's been going in the opposite direction ever since. So just on that point about that Jyoti was just making there, Ian, in relation to organising, I mean, you're used to organising, and I say organising in a difficult area. Any tips on what we people looking at this today could sort of take forward? Because, as I say, you know, we can talk to the cows come home here about the great ideas and common sense, but what practical difference can we make on the ground? And in the end, we need to organize people, and we need a mass movement, don't we, to demand change and, you know, ultimately to get people, you know, elected who are going to represent the people that actually put them there, the vast, you know, the many, not the few.
No, and yeah, an organisation is the key. I mean, listen, in 2014, the Bakers Union was seen as the far left of the RMT, which was unusual. But you know, that was because we were calling for the end of 0 hours contracts, the end of youth rates, and the introduction of a £10 minimum wage. Of course, by 2017, it became political mainstream, and we were no longer seen as extremists. Obviously, we're seen as extremists again because we're calling for £15 an hour. Because we believe in raising the expectations and the aspirations of workers. We don't think, you know, that we should have artificial low pay as you know, set by you know, college graduates. We believe that, you know, the lives that we lead, that we deserve to have an income from the work that we, you know, that our labour produces, that enables us to have a life that doesn't mean we can afford the basics, but we can afford to live in a decent life, in a decent community, in a decent society. And obviously, you know, we've been organising McDonald's workers and Wetherspoons workers, and, you know, those courageous workers that have taken action, you know, many of them on 0 hours contracts, but have been prepared to stand up and have won significant games. And you know, when we go and talk to workers about the benefits of joining the trade union, we talk about, you know, what those magnificent workers did in McDonald's. You know, they went on strike, you know, in 2 stores. That's all it was, in 2 stores, and they forced the company to roll out, you know, contracts of employment. You know, the Wetherspoons workers went on strike. Now, they never used to get paid if they worked past 11 o'clock, any additional payment. Now they get an extra £1 an hour if they work past 11 o'clock. You know, they used to have youth rates. I know people think, well, it's a pub, they shouldn't be employing young people, but obviously people forget there's like 3 levels to youth rates, but now there is no youth rates in Wetherspoons, and that was because of the action that those workers took. And I know, and then they're not as major gains as we'd like. You know, we'd like them all to be on £15 an hour, but obviously for every single action that they've taken, they've come out of that action and demonstrated that collective organisation can improve, you know, their terms and conditions, which in turn improves lives. And that's the message we have to get to people. I agree about the media stuff, and I agree. You know, this all. You know, you know, one of the problems I think with the Labour Party and the Labour movement is it's forgotten how important that politics are in the workplace. You know, when I first started work, for example, you know, I mean, people would have spoke about politics in the workplace. You know, my first strike was secondary action in support of the nurses in 1979 and 1981. You know, I mean, it wasn't for my terms and conditions. It was out in support of the NHS, because obviously the nurses didn't go on strike, but we all did for them. And I think, you know, we've forgotten that, you know, what the solidarity means and what it means to be part of a community. And we need to instill that back into people. We need to counteract this idea that all of our problems are caused by some other poor people, and actually explain to people, you know, the real difference that we can make by being organised. And again, you know, it does come back to an education. It does come back to making sure that trade unions are actively, you know, involved in their workplace. I mean, you know, one of the problems that I think is, you know, we've allowed for ourselves for too long to rely on politicians to make decisions and bring in legislation to improve our lives. And we've never won that way. You know, they've conceded when we've shown our strength and shown our collective power together. And I think the sooner we understand that our strength and our power for real change comes from solidarity, the sooner we'll get back to understanding what a difference we can make by being organised.
Well, as we know from history, you know, power concedes nothing, and all the gains that we've ever made, you know, thanks to the efforts of the trade union movement, many of which people take for granted now, you know, we're not actually just handed down as a sort of a gesture of a goodwill from the ruling class. It was something that we absolutely had to fight for. And, you know, it's important to remember that, you know, the early trade unionists risked very severe penalties, including transportation to the colonies, as it were. And, we owe a huge debt of gratitude to them. But your point about solidarity, I think, is one that's well made, and we need to, I think, find a way, don't we, of, I suppose, building that. The thing that one of the things that really inspired me about the Corbyn project was this notion of building a social movement. That's one of the reasons why we a number of them are trying to create this resistance movement to sort of capitalize on that, build on that, and to organize people. Because in the end, we're not going to achieve anything unless we win hearts and minds of people and encourage people and empower people to recognize that the power of their collective solidarity is unstoppable. And it's something that we need to build that, and you need to build beyond the sort of boundaries, I guess, of the trade unions. Steve, what's your thoughts on that particular point about how we go about building a movement and delivering the sort of changes that we've been talking about? You still with us, Steve?
Solidarity is absolutely necessary, and whether people decide that they're going to work in a community organization or a trade union or whatever organization of resistance that there is, then that's fine. But I have to say this, right? A general strike on its own, if it's just an economic strike, we could have every union out in the country for the next month. They closed down the country for 3 months. Unless that general strike has got a political perspective and is actually supported to have a real change in society and not just one short-term economic gains, in 10 years' time we'll be back in the same position, because capitalism can concede things in the short term and then they'll claw them back in the long term.
Do you think this COVID situation, though, Steve, do you think the COVID situation could be a catalyst, and what should we be doing then, if you think it is a catalyst, to make the most of it, to basically raise, I think the point you're making, we need to raise political consciousness and raise political expectations, two of the things that we are hoping to achieve through this resistance movement as we build it going forward. But what would you say to that?
Well, I think, first of all, yes, COVID is an opportunity. I'll probably be destroyed for this in the Sun and the Daily Mail tomorrow. But it's an opportunity for working class people, because people that have been told all their life that they're useless, that they're not worth anything, are suddenly shown to be the people who keep society running. The people that work in supermarkets, the people who work in shops, the health service, who everybody clapped, but the government can't give a pay rise. What an absolute disgrace.
Yeah. And
we see now that the working class people are the ones that keep society running. Now, what we need is it's a party. There's no two ways around this. And I say here what Jody says about George Galloway being a weapon. He's a kind of weapon in a way, but not how she described him. But I think that we need to be led from the bottom up. We need community organization. We need trade union organizations. But we need to be putting the working class people that were relevant, that were fighting, that were getting small gains. But all those small gains have to come with a bigger political objective. And working class people aren't stupid. We have fought over the generations, and our forefathers and foremothers have fought. And when they came back from the war, they took on the establishment and they won massive, massive concessions. Now, if they can do it, we can do it. Because the war changed consciousness. Now, this could change consciousness. It's just up to us now to take the bull by the horns and go, the way people have been treated is not good enough. We want an absolute change.
Well, I think there's a real obligation, in my opinion, on the labour movement, on the organised labour movement, to step up to the plate to help to facilitate that. And my mum and dad, you talk about the Second World War generation. My mum and dad came back from the Second World War. They were part of that generation that said they weren't going to go back to the indignity of the means test and fearful of falling ill because they might not have the resources to pay for their medical costs and living in poor quality housing. There's many things, I think, and many more things, frankly, that 45 to 51 Labour government could and indeed should have done. But nevertheless, what they did achieve, it transformed the country and stood this test of 34 years. We had a post-war consensus that saw a bigger and bigger proportion every year of the, as I was saying earlier, of the national income going to workers in their wage packets. The regrettable thing is they didn't put in place an irreversible shift in the balance of power and income in this country, because, as I've already said, many of those gains that were made, have been taken away from us, and we're almost starting, not quite from where we were, but nevertheless, there is a major crisis now in this COVID situation, and it's actually causing incredible hardship for many people. And obviously not just the obvious thing in relation to the numbers of people that have lost their lives and have suffered terrible health problems, but also the other economic impact on those people, and that'll have a long-lasting impact as well. And I keep making this point: we are an incredibly wealthy nation. The fifth biggest economy in the world, a currency issuing sovereign currency. Which gives us enormous flexibility, and we need to be, in my opinion, using that flexibility. But we've got to raise consciousness and build support for that, because there is a massive effort being put into keeping people ignorant of the facts, and keeping people ignorant of what is possible, and that's a real challenge, I think, for the Labour movement, and for all of us who want to see a better life, a better society. But Ian, I mean, obviously the way in which workers are atomized at the moment, and this tendency to work at home now, in many ways it's beneficial for workers, and working from home, and that's good where they've been able to do that. But that in itself, doesn't it, poses challenges to working class solidarity and trade union organisation, doesn't it? Because people are not in a workplace where you can talk to them directly. I mean, have you got any kind of new technological ways of reaching people that are working in a sort of, maybe, I guess perhaps your workers are not so much, the people you organise are probably not the people that do work at home, but nevertheless I'd be interested in your thoughts in relation to that.
Yeah, listen, the challenges now for organising, obviously the days of handing out leaflets outside factories, people run a mile if you're trying to give them a leaflet at the moment. So we're having to come up with new ways of trying to engage with workers, and we've recently tried some new tactics in relation to that. Obviously, the online use of Zoom. I prefer it when Zoom was a nice lolly, but it's currently.
I remember that as well.
It's currently my daily life, as it is for many people now. But we're trying to organise in new ways. Obviously, we've created WhatsApp groups. Like, so when we was doing the Weatherspoons campaign, or when we've been doing the McDonald's, with the health and safety issues, we've managed to group people together and keep everybody informed and updated, and actually got them adding their friends, and obviously other people that work in those workplaces. We've just done a call with Green Corps workers, where obviously there was the massive issue where they had 300 people tested positive for coronavirus. And part of the site's organised, and part of the site isn't organised, because it's broken into different like factories, if you like, So we've started been able to recruit on there through holding online recruitment meetings. We're currently looking at how we can organise non-organised sites in a similar way. So there are opportunities to use the new technology, which obviously we are trying to develop. And obviously some like the teachers, for example, they've been very, very good during this crisis of being able to recruit. It's slightly different for us on the basis that most of our members, as I would imagine the same for the RMT, as most of the people are in work. But obviously from an organising point of view, trade union officers can't get to them to organise them, because obviously there's been massive restrictions placed on us. So we're having to find innovative ways to do it. But it still can happen. And obviously it's up to the Labour movement to design the new model of organising. We have to do it, to survive. But more importantly, we have to do it if we want a society that's fair and equal for everybody to be able to thrive in.
I think one of the things we need to do as well is sort of settle some of our kind of perhaps ideological differences, which seem to plague the left, and and sort of try and pull together in solidarity and recognise the bigger goal in that sense. But we've got a few questions, and we've only got 5 minutes left to go before the end of the show. The question for you, Jyoti, just to perhaps in a sentence from Paul, is asking, what could you say, perhaps in a sentence, to his members to convince them to support the Workers' Party? What would you say in a sentence? What would be the kind of the USP for the?
I would say read our 10-point programme. If you agree that we should have the workers in charge and a planned economy, you should be with us. Okay,
that's very short and succinct. Thank you. That gives us a chance to move on to another question. I might as well stay with you if you don't mind, Jyoti, and I'll come to the others on this. And it's a question from Emily Mansley. He's asking about universal basic income. And I'll just read his question. Said, if we're to keep this monstrous capitalist system, then we need quantitative easing, QE for the people, and not, I think the point that you've been making, not as a benefit, as a basic human right to live in dignity. I've got some question marks myself about universal basic income. I tend to prefer a job guarantee scheme myself, but what's your thoughts, Jyoti? I mean, do the Workers' Party have a position on the universal basic income?
We do, yes. We don't call for a UBI. We do, of course, agree that benefits need a massive overhaul and a massive rise. I mean, it's appalling the way that people who are forced onto benefits because they don't have jobs are treated, and the terrible poverty that they have to endure, and the way that their money is constantly withheld. I mean, you know, the scapegoating is horrendous, and we are massively opposed to that and in favour, you know, benefits must be living benefits. But we don't want to sort of cement in the concept that workers are redundant. As far as we're concerned, everybody has hands to work with. Everybody who is able to work should have useful, meaningful work. Exactly what Steve said earlier. We need useful, meaningful, necessary work. There's plenty of it, and there's plenty of people to do it, and we need to put the two together.
Absolutely. It was the kind of point I think I was alluding to earlier on, and, you know, using the flexibility of being a currency issuing nation, and you know, the fact that there is spare capacity in the economy, and many things that desperately need to be done, from public services, we've already said, social care crisis, right the way across the piece, the desperate need for infrastructure improvements and so on. But Steve, I mean, does the RMT have a position on universal basic income, particularly in the light, I suppose, of the COVID crisis? Perhaps if we'd had a UBI, actually, that would have dealt with, even if it was on a short-term basis, perhaps it would have dealt with the fact that many people did fall through the gaps. You know, with the furlough scheme, there's a lot of people who didn't actually get any benefit at all from that. Do the RMC have a position on universal basic income?
I'm not sure if we do as a trade union, to be honest. So I'm going to just answer this in a personal capacity. I think that if we redistributed all the necessary jobs, people's working week would be vastly reduced. We did away with all the unnecessary jobs, and we could have you know, an income for everybody that people could live on very comfortably. I think that's what we need. And if a few people decided not to go to work, they wanted to spend their time doing art or, you know, studying, whatever they do, then they should be paid money as well. Because I think that as a society, if we were organised, and we, as Julie said, if we had a planned economy, we had a structured society, we had covered the necessary works, of course we're going to need artists, we're going to need poets, we're going to need all these people, and they should be paid as well. And you might have a small, very small minority who don't want to go to work, but I think that you know, capitalism caters for them. I think socialism should be able to cater for them as well. Certainly their kids and families shouldn't suffer because that very small minority might not want to go to work. But I think if we had all those things, a universal basic income, if you want to call that, or a proper living wage, which would be given to everybody, I certainly wouldn't be averse to the idea.
Well, I mean, I think if you look back at what John Maynard Keynes was saying, the famous economist, in 1930, he made a speech suggesting that by this time, well, within 100 years, 2030, the average working week should only be around 15 hours. In fact, I remember growing up in the 1960s being told to get ready for the leisure generation because we would only be working 15 or 20 hours a week, which certainly appealed to me when I was leaving school. And of course, it was anything but that. I mean, people are working longer than they've ever done, you know, many people, to actually try and make ends meet. Ian, just as a final comment, then we've got about a minute left. Any thoughts on universal basic income, perhaps in relation to as a response to COVID and more generally?
Yeah, I mean, we would have liked to have seen it trial during you know this crisis. We have obviously seen corporate UBI, which has gone to the bosses to be paid as a furlough. I think we would have liked to have seen the middleman cut out, and obviously everybody had received that income, and it could have significantly helped people, and you know, probably, you know, it would have ended up being at a higher rate than 80% of the pay. So we would have been very supportive of it. And again, you know, to reduce people's hours, UBI would be a good mechanism for achieving that, and obviously reducing, certainly in our industry, the need for people to work excessive overtime.
Well, it's certainly a debate, and you know, debate between universal basic income versus a job guarantee scheme, neither of which are in situ at the moment, and we desperately need, do we not, a radical overhaul, and that can only be brought about, I think, by working together, building this resistance movement, getting involved with us if you can. If you're a worker and you're not already a member of a trade union, please join a trade union, because that's the only way, frankly, that we can organize ourselves and protect ourselves and try and build a better life for ourselves, our family, and for the wider society. Thank you very much indeed, everybody, for watching. We have run out of time. In fact, we're a minute over time now. If you have got a spare hour next week at the same time, 7 o'clock, we will be on air again, and we will be discussing the way in which Britain is facilitating the Saudi war against Yemen. And we'll also be talking about the particular case of Lance Corporal Ahmed Al-Batati, who people may have seen was protesting outside 10 Downing Street about the fact that Britain's involvement in that war is leading to the worst humanitarian crisis in the world at the moment. And he's currently potentially facing a court-martial. So we will be looking at that and the wider issue. So please join us if you can at 7 o'clock next Wednesday. In the meantime, thank you for tuning in, and good night.